Chapter 16, The Stonecatchers' Song of Sorrow, page 243, our last chapter. On May 17, 2010, I was sitting in my office waiting anxiously when the U.S. Supreme Court announced its decision. Sentences of life imprisonment without parole imposed on children convicted of non-homicide crimes is cruel and unusual punishment and constitutionally impermissible. My staff and I jumped up and down in celebration. Moments later, we were flooded with calls from media, clients, families, and children's rights activists. It was the first time the court had issued a categorical ban on a punishment other than the death penalty. I thought of my clients. Joe Sullivan was entitled to relief. Scores of people, including Antonio Nunez and Ian Manuel, were entitled to reduced sentences. 2 years later, in June 2012, we celebrated another major victory for incarcerated juveniles. The Supreme Court had agreed to review Evan Miller's case and the case of a client from Arkansas, Contrell Jackson. The outcome, a constitutional ban on mandatory life without parole sentences imposed on children convicted of homicides. This meant that no child accused of any crime could ever again be automatically sentenced to die in prison. There were more than 2,000 condemned people who had been sentenced as children to life imprisonment without parole. Now they were potentially eligible for relief and reduced sentences. Across the country, many prosecutors resisted retroactively applying the court's decision in Miller v. Alabama to old cases. But everyone now had new hope, including Trina Garnett. We continued our work on issues involving children by pursuing more cases. I believe that no children under the age of 18 should be housed with adults in jails or prisons. We filed cases seeking to stop the practice. I'm also convinced that very young children should never be tried in adult court. No child of 12, 13, or 14 can defend him or herself in the adult criminal justice system. Wrongful convictions and illegal trials involving young children are too common. I was encouraged by the fact that nationwide the rate of mass incarceration was finally slowing down. For the first time in close to 40 years, the country's prison population did not increase in 2011. In 2012, the United States saw the first decline in its prison population in decades. Our death penalty work had also taken a hopeful turn. We'd won relief for 100 death row prisoners in Alabama. In 2013, the state recorded the lowest number of new death sentences since the mid-1970s. These were very hopeful developments. We were able to finally launch the Race and Poverty Initiation I'd long been hoping to start at EJI. For years, I wanted to start a project to change the way we talk about racial history and how it informs contemporary race issues. We started working with poor children and families in Black Belt counties across the South. We brought hundreds of high school students in our office for fascinating discussions about rights and justice. Also, we worked on reports and materials to deepen the national conversation about the legacy of slavery and lynching, and our nation's history of racial injustice. I found the new race and poverty work extremely energizing. It closely connected to our criminal justice work. So much of our worst thinking about justice is steeped in the mist of racial difference. I believe that there are 4 institutions in American history that have shaped our approach to race and justice, but remain poorly understood. The first, of course, is slavery, and the second is the reign of terror against people of color that followed the collapse of the Reconstruction through World War II. Older people of color in the South would occasionally come up to me after speeches to complain at how antagonized they feel when they hear news commentators talking about how 9/11 was the first act of domestic terrorism in America. An older African-American man once told me, "You make them stop saying that. We grew up with terrorism all the time. The police, the Klan, anybody who was white could terrorize you. We had to worry about bombings and lynchings, racial violence of all kinds." The racial terrorism of lynching in many ways created the modern-day death penalty. Americans' embrace of speedy execution was, in part, an attempt to redirect the violence of lynching while assuring white Southerners that black men would still pay the ultimate price. Another practice that is not well known to most Americans is convict leasing. Convict leasing was introduced at the end of the 19th century to criminalize former slaves and convict them of nonsensical offenses so that freed men, women, and children could be leased to businesses and effectively forced back into slave labor. Private industries throughout the country made millions of dollars with free convict labor, while thousands of African Americans died in horrific work conditions. The practice of re-enslavement was so widespread in some states that it was categorized in a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Douglas Blackmun as Slavery by Another Name. Racial terror and the constant threat created by violently enforcing racial hierarchy were profoundly traumatizing for African Americans, creating all kinds of psychosocial distortion and difficulties that still manifest themselves today. The third institution, Jim Crow, is the legalized racial segregation and suppression of basic rights that defined America through 1876 through 1965. It is more recent and is recognized in our national consciousness, but is still not well understood. It seems to me that we've been quick to celebrate the achievements of the civil rights movement and slow to recognize the lasting damage of marginalization and subordination done in that era. The legacy of racial profiling carries many of the same complications. Once I was preparing to do a hearing in a trial court in the Midwest and was sitting at the counsel table in an empty courtroom before the hearing. I was wearing a dark suit, white shirt, and tie. The judge and the prosecutor entered through the door in the back of the courtroom, laughing and chatting. When the judge saw me sitting at the defense table, he said to me harshly, "Hey, you shouldn't be in here without counsel. Go back outside and wait in the hallway until your lawyer arrives." I stood up and smiled broadly. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor, we haven't met. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer on the case set for hearing this morning." The judge laughed at his mistake, and the prosecutor joined in. I forced myself to laugh because I didn't want my young client, a white child who had been prosecuted as an adult, to be disadvantaged by a conflict I had created with the judge before the hearing. But I was disheartened by the experience. Of course, innocent mistakes occur, but constantly being underestimated, suspected, accused, watched, doubted, distrusted, presumed guilty, and even feared in a burden borne by people of color that can't be understood or confronted without a deeper conversation about our history of racial injustice. The fourth institution is mass incarceration. Going into any prison is deeply confusing if you know anything about the racial demographics of America. The extreme overrepresentation and disproportionate sentencing of racial minorities, the targeted prosecution of drug crimes in poor communities, the criminalization of new immigrants and undocumented people, the political consequences of disenfranchising black voters, essentially denying black people the right to vote, and the barriers to re-entering the world after incarceration can only be fully understood through the lens of our racial history. It was gratifying to be able, finally, to address some of these issues with young people and the community. I became hopeful that together we might be able to push back against the suppression of this difficult history of racial injustice. A bigger staff, bigger cases, and a bigger docket also sometimes meant bigger problems. While exciting and very gratifying, enforcing the Supreme Court ruling banning life without parole sentences for children convicted of non-homicides was proving much more difficult than I had hoped. Some judges seemed to want to get as close to life expectancy or death as possible before they would release child offenders. For example, Antonio Nunez's judge in Orange County, California, replaced his sentence of life imprisonment without parole with a sentence of 175 years. I had to go back to an appellate court in California and argue to that sentence replaced with something reasonable. We met resistance in Joe Sullivan's and Ian Manuel's cases as well. Ultimately, we were able to get sentences that meant they could both be released after serving a few more years. In some cases, clients had already been in prison for decades and had very few, if any, support systems to help them re-enter society. We decided to create a re-entry program specifically for people who had spent many years in prison after being incarcerated when they were children. We would offer services, housing, job training, life skills counseling, and anything else people coming out of prison needed to succeed. We told the judges and parole boards we were committed to providing the assistance our clients required. In particular, the Louisiana clients serving life without parole for non-homicides faced many challenges. We undertook representation of all 60 of those eligible for relief. Almost all of them were at Angola, a notoriously difficult place to do time. Angola, a plantation before the end of the Civil War, forced inmates to work in fields picking cotton. Prisoners were required to do manual labor in very difficult work environments or face solitary confinement or other discipline. It was not uncommon for inmates to be seriously injured. losing fingers or limbs after working long hours in brutal and dangerous conditions. For years, prisoners who refused would receive write-ups that went into their files and would face months of solitary confinement. We decided to prioritize resentencing hearings for the old-timers, juvenile lifers who had been at Angola prison for decades. Joshua Carter and Robert Caston were the first two cases we decided to litigate. Mr. Carter had been in prison for 50 years. There, he developed glaucoma and didn't get the medical care he needed. He lost his sight in both eyes. Mr. Caston had been in Angola for 45 years. He lost several fingers working in a prison factory and was now disabled as a result of his forced labor at Angola. I traveled back and forth between the trial courts in Orleans Parish quite a bit on the Carter and Caston's cases. The Orleans Parish Courthouse is a massive structure with intimidating architecture. There are multiple courtrooms aligned down an enormous hallway with grand marble floors and high ceilings. Hundreds of people crowd the hallways, bustling between the various courtrooms each day. Hearings in the vast courthouses are never reliably scheduled. Frequently, there would be a date and time for the Carter and Caston resentencing, but it seemed to mean very little to anyone. I would arrive in court, and there would always be a stack of cases, and clients with lawyers gathered in an overcrowded courtroom, all waiting to be heard at the time of our hearings. Overwhelmed judges tried to manage the proceedings with bench meetings, while dozens of young men, most of whom were black, sat handcuffed in standard jail-issued orange jumpsuits in the front of the court. Lawyers consulted with clients and family members scattered around the chaotic courtroom. After 3 trips to New Orleans for sentencing hearings, we still did not have a new sentence for Mr. Carter or Mr. Caston. We met with the DA, filed papers with the judge, and consulted with a variety of local officials in an effort to achieve a new constitutionally acceptable sentence. Because Mr. Carter and Mr. Caston had both been in prison for nearly 50 years, we wanted their immediate release. There were 2 different judges and courtrooms involved, but we felt if we won immediate release for one, it might then become easier to win release for the other. Finally, it seemed we were close to success. After I made our arguments in the frenetic courtroom, the judge granted our motion. She detailed Mr. Caston's 45 years at Angola for a non-homicide crime when he was 16. She noted that he had been sent to Angola in the 1960s. Then the judge pronounced a new sentence that meant Mr. Caston would be immediately released. Then the people in the silent courtroom did something I'd never seen before. They erupted in applause. The defense lawyers, prosecutors, family members, and deputy sheriffs applauded. Other inmates waiting for their own cases to be addressed applauded in their handcuffs. Even the judge, who usually tolerated no disruptions, seemed to embrace the drama of the moment. Mr. Caston was overjoyed. He became the first person to be released as a result of the Supreme Court's ban on death in prison sentences for juvenile lifers. We were thrilled and ready for the next case. We were down the hall to Mr. Carter's courtroom. Mr. Carter had a large family who had maintained a close relationship with him despite the passage of time. His mother was nearly 100 years old. She had vowed to Mr. Carter for decades that she wouldn't die until he came home from prison. To our great joy, we had another success, winning a new sentence that meant that he, too, would be released immediately. Mr. Carter's family was ecstatic. There were hugs and promises of home-cooked meals for me and the staff of EJI. Exhausted, I wandered the halls of the courthouse, waiting for one more paper to be approved to clear the way for the release of Mr. Caston and Mr. Carter. That's when I noticed an older black woman sitting on the marble steps in the massive courthouse hallway. She had smooth, dark skin, and I recognized her as someone who had been in the courtroom. I assumed that she was related or connected to one of the clients. She waved at me, gesturing for me to come to her. When I walked over to her, she smiled at me. Sit. I want to talk to you," she said. She had a sweet voice that crackled. I sat down beside her on the steps. "I've seen you here several times. Are you related to Mr. Caston or Mr. Carter?" I asked. No. I'm not related to nobody here. Not that I know of, anyway." She had a kind smile, and she looked at me intensely. "I just come here to help people. This is a place full of pain, so people need plenty of help around here." "Well, that's really kind of you." "No, it's what I'm supposed to do, so I do it." She looked away before locking eyes with me again. "My 16-year-old grandson was murdered 15 years ago," she said, "and I love that boy more than life itself." I wasn't expecting that response and was instantly sobered. The woman grabbed my hand. I grieved and grieved and grieved. I asked the Lord why he let someone take my child like that. He was killed by some other boys. I came to this courtroom for the first time for their trials and sat in there and cried every day for nearly 2 weeks. None of it made any sense. Those boys were found guilty for killing my grandson, and the judge sent them away to prison forever. I thought it would make me feel better, but it actually made me feel worse. She continued, I sat in the courtroom after they were sentenced and just cried and cried. A lady came over to me and gave me a hug while let me lean on her. She asked me if the boys who got sentenced were my children, and I told her no. I told her the boy they killed was my child. She hesitated. I think she sat with me for almost 2 hours. For well over an hour, neither one of us say a word. It felt good to finally have someone to lean on at that trial. I've never forgotten that woman. I don't know who she was, but she made a difference. I'm so sorry about your grandson, I murmured. It was all I could think of to say. Well, you never fully recover, but you carry on, you carry on. I didn't know what to do with myself after those trials, so about a year later, I started coming down here. I don't really know why. I guess I just felt like maybe I could be someone, that somebody hurting could lean on. She looped her arm with mine. I smiled at her. That's really wonderful. It has been wonderful. What's your name again? It's Bryan. All these young children being sent to prison forever, all this grief and violence, those judges throwing people away like they're not even human, people shooting each other, hurting each other like they don't care. It's a lot of pain. I decided that I was supposed to be here to catch some of the stones being cast at each other. I chuckled when she said it. It reminded me of a talk I had given at a church meeting during the McMillan hearings. There were a few people in the African American community who withheld support of Walter, not because they thought he was guilty, but because he had an extramarital affair and wasn't active in the church. At the church meeting, I spoke mostly about Walter's case, but I also reminded people that when the woman accused of adultery was brought to Jesus, he told the accusers who wanted to stone her to death, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Accusers retreated, and Jesus forgave. But today, our self-righteousness, our fear, and our anger have caused us to hurl stones at the people who fall down, even when we know we should forgive or show compassion. I told the congregation that we can't simply watch that happen. I told them we have the Stonecatchers. When I chuckled at the older woman's invocation of the parable, she laughed too. I heard you in that courtroom today. I've even seen you here a couple times before. I know you're a Stonecatcher too. I laughed even more. Well, I guess I try to be. She put her arm around me and smiled back. No, you done good today. I was so happy when that judge said that man was going home. It gave me goosebumps. 50 years in prison. He can't even see no more. She squeezed me a bit and then said, now you keep this up and you're going to end up like me, singing some sad songs. She paused and grew silent. I heard her chuckle before she had continued. But you keep singing. Your songs will make you strong. They might even make you happy. People buzzed down the busy corridors of the courthouse while we sat silently. When I finally excused myself, giving her a kiss on the cheek and telling her I needed to sign the prisoner's release papers, she stopped me. Oh, wait. She dug around in her purse until she found a piece of wrapped peppermint candy. Here, take this. The gesture made me happy in a way that I can't fully explain. Well, thank you. I grinned appreciatively. She waved at me, smiling. Go on, page 256. Toodles.